And we're on. Public diplomat, Guy Chet. How you doing?
Doing well. Can't complain in public, right?
Well, you should. I'm going to complain in public. So ask me where I just came back from.
Where'd you just come back from?
I just came back from the gas station. You know how much I paid?
I would say, knowing your car, $50 or $60.
$70. I paid $4 and I think 48 cents for gas. When I moved to Texas, what is it, 3-4 years ago, it was $1.20.
No.
What happened? $1.20. So I mean, to be honest, what really happened? Stimulus, COVID, after COVID, demand, obviously supply and demand, government regulation, the Federal Reserve. We can talk about all this stuff, but obviously Russia, Ukraine, the Ukraine. By the way, it's Ukraine. It's not the Ukraine. Did you know that?
So when I grew up, we used to play Risk.
Okay.
And it was always referred to as the Ukraine.
Uh-huh.
And so you know why it changed, right?
Talk about it.
So regions are called like the Ural Mountains or the steppes of Russia or the Great Plains. But countries are called, Ukraine, Israel, Lebanon, etc. So the in the Ukraine or the Congo is kind of an imperial legacy.
Here you go. So it's supposed
of
to
seeing it as a region.
We don't say the Ukraine anymore. Right. There are two countries you can actually call by the Gambia and the Bahamas. Those are the two exceptions. Other than that, nothing else. But that's not what we're talking about today. So let's talk about Russia and Ukraine. February 24th, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. And let's talk about, did we get it right? I mean, really, when you think about it, this was the most telegraphed invasion or the least surprising invasion in the history of the world. You're a historian, I'm not, but I'm going to make that statement. When the Russians were massing their troops on the border, the Biden administration used the mainstream media to clearly telegraph intelligence information, right? They said Vladimir Putin is going to attack sometime in February. He's going to attack sometime in mid-February. He's going to attack next Wednesday. Yep. And many people thought that this was just a way to put pressure on the Russians not to invade. And when you really think about it, the stock market didn't believe it. And the stock market is the best predictor of the future, right? I mean, stock market, it acted like it's not going to happen. So let's talk about it. Did we get this right?
Look, I mean, the stock market is not a predictor of the future. It's a reflection of what people know or think they know, or what people think. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So while we're telegraphing that the Russians are going to invade, nobody really believed. So did we get this whole thing right? Let's talk about it from the beginning.
So first of all, I'm not sure that they didn't believe. They might not have thought it was going to be that disruptive an event. Like even if you thought it was, look, I can tell you that, hey, Gambia is going to invade whichever country is on the borders of Gambia, and the stock, and let's say it happens. Okay, the stock market is not going to be rocked because most companies don't think that it's a rocking event. So maybe it's not that the stock market didn't believe it would happen, but either they believed our intelligence that it's going to be an instantaneous war, victory, and therefore the economy and the commerce will remain as is, or they didn't believe.
Yeah. So I mean, when we talk about did we get it right or did they get it right? Who's they? But the government, the media, right? We're talking about A, is there going to be an invasion, and B, what is this invasion going to look like? Think about the early narratives about this potential invasion, the Russian invasion.
Yeah, so look, by they, I don't count the media, because the media just parrots what the intelligence services tell them, or the army. So, look, when we look at how the government, how the intelligence services performed in the past, they have, I'm sure they have a list of things they got right, but a lot of iconic intel statements were embarrassingly wrong, from just recently about what's his name, Milley, General Milley's assurance to the U.S. government that the Afghan army will fold, and saying that we didn't expect that the army would collapse, and it took us all by surprise. And then failing to predict the fall of the Soviet Union, failing to predict the Russian invasion, the failure to predict the Iranian Revolution, the failure to predict, it's not predictions, it's reading. The
Arab Spring, weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction, exactly. Right. Yeah. So the failures are numerous. All these kind of slam dunks. The nuclear breakout of Pakistan. Whoa! How can you miss it? In any case, so they have
North Korea.
North Korea too. Yeah.
All right.
So they've had a lot of failures in predicting, but in this case they predicted well. But as you said, I think what you're angling for is that they predicted, and that's what we heard in the media, that it's going to be a romp. It'll be over in very quickly.
Yeah, which it didn't turn out to be, right? I mean, the Ukrainians. Can we say
the Ukrainians is fine. Yeah.
Linguistics here. The Ukrainian people are holding strong resistance. And let's talk about the news media today, right? Are they getting the story right today? We keep on hearing different narratives about what's happening on the ground. And of course, modern coverage of wars is very different than 50 years ago, 40, even 20 years ago. I mean, we have social media now, so a common soldier, Russian or Ukrainian, with their cell phones on TikTok, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter, whatever the kids are using these days, can deliver content from the field. So is the media getting the story right now about what is actually happening on the ground right now and how it's going to turn out?
So look, I put the media to the side. The media is a mouthpiece. Again, I'm not saying it's derogatorily, but I'm not trying to be derogatory. But where's the media going to get their intel? They're getting it from the Russian government or government kind of media, from the Ukrainian government and government media, and from the American government and government media. So, and neither one of those entities, the Russians, the Ukrainians, or the Americans, have a track record or can be relied upon to provide objective intel. So we're at the mercy of these intel sources. And look, I agree. Like we're getting this narrative of the Ukrainian resistance, and you've seen these images. Yeah, I can't. Images of tractors pulling Russian and tanks burning and everything, and that that Russian ship sunk. Those are all the images I see, and I follow the news pretty closely. And yet, when you look at the map, constantly the red part, the part where that the Russians are occupying, is growing. So all the images and the stories are about effective resistance and the Russians getting their butts kicked, and yet the map shows the opposite. So wait and see.
We're waiting. It's a real challenge. I mean, when you really think about foreign news or foreign media coverage of international events, we are so dependent on elite sources because we have no access as journalists, right? I mean, there are a lot of journalists who actually flew there. I don't want to agree. I will disagree with you that we're entirely dependent on government sources. There are a lot of very brave journalists on the ground collecting information, collecting data, interviewing people, getting stories from the inside. But yeah, I mean, obviously, individual journalists does not have the same megaphone as NATO briefings, military briefings, etc.
And actually, let me ask you, you're more familiar with where news is generated. Is most of the news that we're getting reports from the field, or is most of the news generated about the war in Ukraine generated in Washington, D.C., New York, and other European capitals? Like, is it created by newspapers and bureaus in the West, or by journalists in Ukraine?
It's a fantastic question. I think the answer is both. And what I would argue is that the journalists on the ground are providing data points, right? They're bringing the quotes, they're bringing the data points, they're bringing new insights, new information that nobody else has. What the folks above, the editors, the producers, the gatekeepers, really do is provide framing. Framing is an academic term, right, that explains how events are interpreted, right? So what is the problem in the field, right? So let's take the Western narrative, right? What is the problem? Russian aggression, right? What is the cause of the problem? Putin wants to be the new czar, right? A moral attribution, bad guy. What is the solution? Get out of Ukraine, right? And then take the counter narrative, right? Which is the Russian narrative, which looks completely different, right? Why is there a war in Ukraine? Because they argue that the fascists are taking over, the Nazis are taking over, and NATO expansionism and all that. And obviously, the bad guys are the West and President Zelensky. And the solution is for Ukraine to go back to its old ways and join the Russian sphere of influence, right? But Guy, let's talk about that. I mean, we talk about counter narratives, but there's one narrative that we really don't have exposure to is why did Putin, I mean, he really climbed on a tree they can't get up, right? He can't climb down off, right? Nobody's seen an end to this story. Why did Putin invade?
You don't know that. Look, granted, if we think that his original objective was to conquer Ukraine and take over the country, it doesn't look like he's doing it. But if his objective, like it was in Georgia, was to liberate and kind of tear off border areas and weaken the country so that it won't be able to join NATO and to put the kibosh on Georgia's attempt to join, request to join NATO, if that was his objective here, then again, if you look at the map at least, he's accomplishing it, and it's hard to imagine that the West or Ukraine will be in position to wrest those eastern and southern parts of Ukraine back from Russia. So I don't know. Look, I don't know what. Until we see Putin's diary and saying, I invaded because of this.
We're going to invite Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is invited to our podcast show anytime.
Episode 5.
There we go, episode 5. No, but I mean, you can't really get into the mind of Vladimir Putin. But there are counter narratives about what causes war in Ukraine. The first one is Western weakness, and the second one is Western strength. So I'm going to present the Western weakness frame or narrative, and you tell me what you think about it, and then I'm going to ask you to present the counter narrative, right? The Western weakness narrative argues that Putin is watching American behavior around the world, right? The United States, after the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, basically don't want to get involved. I mean, it starts with Obama, it goes to Trump, and the message everywhere is very simple. America and the West, so the French, the British, the Germans, they don't want to get involved in any major military interventions. I'm not talking about the French in Mali, but, we're talking about Syria, where basically, despite President Obama's red lines, the United States didn't get involved when Bashar Assad slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, right?
And despite the effort by the lobbyists in the army and in the major media outlets. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I mean, the United States doesn't get involved in Syria. Vladimir Putin looks at that. He's like, okay, I'm going to go in there and take over, and he did, right? So the Russians go into Syria. That worked out well. Then the whole story with Crimea, he goes in there, he annexes Crimea. The West doesn't really do anything about it, slight sanctions. And then comes the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which, as you previously stated, was an absolute mess, right? The United States looks weak, the United States runs away, and the message to its international rivals is America is no longer the world leader. So why the heck not? Why not bring back Russian influence, bring back Chinese influence, bring back Iranian influence, bring back Turkish influence? And we've seen that over and over and over. But when Vladimir Putin attacks Ukraine. We see the re-emergence of NATO. We see strong sanctions, and nobody ever believed, not only from the United States, but from the European Union. And that is the Western weakness narrative. Can you provide the counter narrative, which is the Western strength?
Yeah. So the argument, the problem with this narrative that you just introduced is the timing. Okay? That yes, of course, the Russians invade or mess with in Georgia, in Crimea, and now in the rest of Ukraine, in periods where the West is weak or preoccupied by other things, and therefore can't respond. It's a window of opportunity, but that doesn't explain the desire to do so. Okay, so the timing is an opportunity. The desire is what needs to be explained.
All right, let's talk about the desire.
And so the desire is either, the two narratives are either that, look, the Russians always want to expand because they're imperialists and on top of that, they're really bad. Their leader is a very bad person. And this has been the mainstay of Western explanation for Russian or Soviet aggression in the past. And then in the 1950s, I think, or 60s, a different school of thought came about, I'm assuming in academia first and in the State Department, George Kennan, I think, that explained Soviet foreign policy based on Russian history and Russian insecurity, because Russia is such a huge country without any natural borders, with a history of invasions from all sides, and it explained Russia's creation of spheres of influence, of buffer zones around it, as a product of Russian sense of vulnerability rather than a sense of Russian aggression. So in this case, again, so it's either that the Russians are naturally expansionist, or that the Russians have felt, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, a sense of insecurity. Okay? And therefore, they're trying to recreate some sort of sense of security. And if you look at the maps of, again, just look at the maps in the mid-90s of NATO versus Russia, and how you had Russia without Eastern Europe as its buffer zone of Soviet republics, and NATO, very far apart. And then in the 90s and early 2000s, one empire, one military alliance, NATO, is
getting closer and closer.
Getting closer and closer and consistently and without any halting, closer and closer, all the way to the borders of Russia. And so, look, and there's a great deal of resistance to this explanation in the West because, oh, you're pro-Russia, or you're pro-Putin, or you're a mouthpiece for Xi Jinping. But take away the US and the Soviets and good guys and bad guys. Let's imagine that this is ancient Egypt and the Assyrian Empire. And just look at the maps, okay? How do you interpret this kind of move? And how do you think that power that is getting encroached upon would see it? Okay, so we know that we're good and we mean the Russians no harm. But how can the Russians know it? Okay, what, the last 70 years would teach them that the US doesn't mean them any harm? They've been at war with us forever. And now they've become weak with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And here we are, approaching and encircling them from Georgia through Turkey to the Baltic Sea. Okay, and now especially with Ukraine trying to get into NATO, maybe all the way to their borders. So the question is, if it's true that NATO doesn't mean Russia any harm, how come NATO hasn't ever invited Russia to join NATO? Okay, now the argument is, well, it's only for democracies. Like Turkey?
Wow, that's a strong point. It's a good point. And we don't get this narrative in the Western media. And again, it goes back to media indexing, right, which we spoke about. Or did we speak about indexing yet? Or no? Let's talk about media indexing.
The furrowed brow tells you that we haven't.
Okay, there you go, right? So how does the media decide on how to explain narratives, how to frame, how to explain international conflicts? And there's a really interesting concept from mass communication. This is by Professor Lance Bennett. It's called media indexing. And what it predicts, it's a really cool concept, I think, is that whenever there is elite consensus about any topic in the world, the news media will mirror the elite consensus. So whatever
the what would it mirror?
Elite consensus, right? So if the elites agree that Iraq have weapons of mass destruction, right? So Democrats and Republicans alike believe that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the news media will adopt that narrative. Why? Bennett explains there are several reasons. One has to do with the dependence of sources on government, right? They don't want to lose access. Number two is they don't want to get it wrong. They trust, they're like, wow, but if everybody agrees, all the experts, all the military, all the think tanks, all the politicians agree, they probably know something I don't know, right? So it's kind of a play it safe strategy. And number three, they don't want to get in trouble with not only with the sources, but with the public. So if everybody in the elites are behind the narrative, the chances are that many of the public are behind it. So there is a dynamic where the news media will adapt the widely agreed upon narrative and tell a story just like the elites, right? So this is why I think the narrative that we both put forward looks very different in the Western media and in the Russian media. I mean, if you watch RT or any of the opposition channels to the West, you're going to hear a lot more about the kind of narrative they described, right? About NATO expansionism and European expansionism and so forth. The real question is, when is the break in indexing happen? And the answer is when the elites start disagreeing. So we saw that in Iraq, we saw that in Afghanistan. As soon as the elites began to disagree with one another, the news media steps in and provides a counter narrative. At least that's what indexing will suggest.
That's interesting with regard to the Soviet Union, because like I told you, from the Soviet Revolution to the about 1950s or 60s, there was unanimity about what is driving Soviet aggression. And then around that time, in the mid-century, at least in the State Department, there was a different voice. And I think, again, during that time is that era marks the highest level of Americans' exposure through the media to kind of communist narrative, communist propaganda. Okay, again during the 50s and 60s. And then, but in the 70s and 80s, there seemed to once again be a consensus left and right by Cold Warriors like, JFK to Richard Nixon and whoever came after them, about, that no, it's not Soviet insecurity, it's Soviet aggression. And that was reflected, I think that kind of bears out what you're saying, that there was a window of lack of consensus in the elites, left and right, and it filtered to what Americans were exposed to, and then it reunited.
Listen, it's going to be interesting to see how this is going to play out in the news media as the war continues, right? And it will evolve. I mean, the war will evolve, and hopefully it will end as soon as possible. Hopefully today, but I mean, it's not looking like it, right? It looks like
not today. No.
Playing the long game right now, despite the strongest economic sanctions we've ever seen in the modern era.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no indication that, so far at least, that the sanctions are having a significant effect on, or a debilitating effect on the Russian economy or the Russian war effort. So,
but listen, there is an argument, and it's a really interesting one, that everything that's happening right now in Ukraine is having an impact on a different rival of the United States, and that is China, right? I mean, many people have argued that the strong stance by the Biden administration, by NATO, by the EU, is actually going to work as a deterrent for China with Taiwan and the aggression in the South China Seas. What do you think about that?
We don't even know if it's strong pushback. I mean, yes, these are strong sanctions, but we don't know. I mean, like I said, the Russian war effort is continuing fairly successfully, not as successfully as they would have wanted, no doubt. But look, if in 6 months you and I are going to meet here and talk about Ukraine giving up a third of its territory, then the message, the lesson that the Chinese will get from this will be very different. Look, it seems to me that the big question about the response of the EU, and we don't even know how long these sessions. Look, this war has been, what, only 3 months, 4 months long? The West might lose interest tomorrow, and all this talk about kind of NATO's resilience or the EU or the UN will go away, because look, there's this tension in the second half, in the 20th century, between this major force of nationalism and nation states governing their own affairs, and the pushback through international bodies like NAFTA and the UN and the League of Nations before, and NATO and the World Trade Organization, etc., of who will govern, how will the world be governed through these global or international forums, which necessarily limit the freedom of action of individual nations, or the opposite. You know, the individual nations will pursue their individual things, and so obviously NATO is one of the most important of these international governing bodies. It's the strongest military power in the world, or military alliance in the world.
One could say that it's the strongest it's been in a long time. I mean, think about NATO just 4 years ago when Trump was bashing it, saying, hey, you guys have to contribute to this dying body. NATO's reemerged. Oh my God, right?
Yeah. So the question is, and this is what the West has to figure out and China has to figure out or learn, what is NATO for? Like, we knew what NATO was for during the Cold War. If you ask people up there, what is NATO for? Is it just to keep the peace in the world, or just in Europe? Or like, it's really unclear. If the purpose is to keep Russia in check, then China doesn't have to consider it as relevant to them. If it's to keep the peace in the world, then it's relevant to China. If it's just to keep the peace in Europe, it's a different question. So the West isn't clear. Like, of all these governing bodies, the one that is the most muscular is NATO. And I think look, even you and I, probably don't have a consensus, a clear understanding of what NATO is for. And until we find out, the Chinese won't find out either.
Right, so I'm going to challenge anybody listening right now to, in the comment section, tell us, what is NATO for? Do we know? That's a great question. And I think this is where we're going to end our show today, guys. So next time we're going to meet, we're going to talk about how history is written. You're an historian, and I'm fascinated by that question. So let's end today's section and show. Thanks very much. And everybody who's watching, thanks so much. And keep on tuned for the Public Diplomat. Next time, see you then.